Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean. Tell me, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? I'd love to know. Share it in the comments along with how you liked the story. I reply to every single one of you. Now let's step into the mystery. In a lush Ottoman-inspired garden at twilight, a priceless ruby necklace gleams under lantern light, its blood-red glow hiding a deadly curse. A curved dagger drips with blood among crimson roses, as whispers of betrayal echo through jasmine-draped arches. Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster, spots clues. A silk thread, a shattered lens, a hidden heel mark missed by all. Shadowy figures, elegant yet treacherous, conceal greed and deceit. As a haunting violin swells, a voiceover whispers, "In a paradise of secrets, one truth cuts deep." The ruby pulses, and Miss Marple's knowing glance pierces the mist. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Eden. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels against the rails lulled Miss Jane Marple into a contemplative reverie as she gazed out at the rolling English hills, their greens fading into the haze of an autumn afternoon. At her age, one did not embark on such journeys lightly, yet the cream-coloured envelope that had arrived at her cottage in St. Mary Mead had piqued her interest like a whisper of scandal in the vicarage tea-room. Sir Reginald Hargreaves, known far and wide as the Sultan for his eccentric passion for all things Ottoman, had extended a personal invitation to a select weekend gathering at his sprawling estate. The purpose? To unveil a magnificent ruby necklace, a relic from the court of a long-forgotten Turkish pasha, said to rival the jewels of Scheherazade herself. Miss Marple adjusted her sensible woolen shawl against the chill seeping through the compartment window. Her nephew Raymond had teased her mercilessly about mingling with the aristocracy. "Aunt Jane, you'll be lost among the peacocks and fountains," he'd said with a grin. But she knew better. In her quiet village life, she had observed that grandeur often concealed the same petty jealousies and hidden motives as a disputed will or a pilfered brooch. Curiosity, that unquenchable spark, had compelled her to accept. After all, what harm could come from a weekend amid exotic splendour? As the train pulled into the station at Hargreaves Holt, a private stop funded by Sir Reginald's considerable fortune, a liveried chauffeur awaited her with a gleaming Rolls-Royce. The drive to the estate wound through manicured lanes until the gates of Hargreaves Hall swung open to reveal a sight that might have been plucked from the pages of the Arabian Nights. The ancestral manor, a stately Georgian pile, had been whimsically augmented with slender minarets piercing the sky, their tips glinting gold in the waning light. But it was the gardens that truly captivated. Vast expanses of terraced lawns transformed into an oriental paradise. Fountains murmured secrets into mosaic-tiled pools, while arches draped in climbing jasmine-framed pathways lined with date palms and vibrant blooms, scarlet tulips from Istanbul, delicate orchids smuggled from the Levant. Hidden aviaries echoed with the calls of exotic birds, and somewhere in the distance, the iridescent flash of a peacock's tail caught the eye. Sir Reginald himself greeted her at the grand entrance, a robust man in his late 50s with a waxed moustache and eyes twinkling with the fervour of a collector. "Miss Marple, delighted you've come. Your reputation for keen insight precedes you, though I dare say this weekend is all about beauty, not puzzles." He swept her into the hall, where Persian rugs muffled their footsteps, and walls groaned under the weight of Ottoman artefacts. Jewelled scimitars, intricate tapestries depicting sultans in repose, and glass cases filled with ancient coins that whispered of empires long crumbled. The other guests were already assembled in the drawing-room, a chamber adorned with silk cushions and low divans that encouraged languid conversation. Lady Evelyn Hargreaves, Sir Reginald's wife, rose gracefully to welcome her, a tall, elegant woman with silver-streaked hair and a smile that never quite reached her cool blue eyes. "How charming to have you here, Miss Marple. Reginald speaks so highly of your observations." There was a faint edge to her voice, like the subtle discord in a village choir. Beside her stood their son Victor, a handsome young man in his 30s, with the polished charm of a society darling, though Miss Marple noted the faint shadows under his eyes, and the way his fingers drummed restlessly against his thigh. Engaged to him was Miss Clara Beaumont, the rising star of the London stage, her auburn curls framing a face alive with vivacity. She laughed brightly at some jest, but her gaze flicked appraisingly over the room, as if calculating the value of every ornament. Then there was Dr. Elias Thorne, a bespectacled scholar whose expertise in Eastern antiquities had earned him a place at the table. He hovered near a sideboard, peering intently at a miniature Koran bound in gold leaf, his thin lips pursed in what might have been envy or scholarly disdain. Last came Mr. Karim Al-Fayed, the Cairo merchant who had procured the ruby necklace. Dark-haired and impeccably dressed in a Western suit with an Eastern flair, a silk cravat patterned like a desert sunset, he exuded an air of quiet confidence, his accent a melodic blend of Nile shores and Oxford polish. As the group adjourned for a twilight tour of the gardens, Sir Reginald led the way with booming enthusiasm, pointing out rarities. A fountain carved from Anatolian marble, its waters scented with rose attar, a gazebo modelled after the Topkapi Palace, where lanterns swayed like fireflies. The air was heavy with the perfume of night-blooming flowers, and the setting sun painted the minarets in hues of amber and rose. Yet, amid the splendour, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle dissonances. Lady Evelyn's hand tightened briefly on her husband's arm, her smile a mask over some unspoken strain. Victor exchanged a furtive glance with Al-Fayed, a look charged with urgency rather than mere acquaintance. Clara's laughter rang a touch too loudly as she admired a bed of imported lilies, while Dr. Thorne lingered by a display pedestal, his fingers tracing the empty space where the necklace would soon rest, his expression one of possessive hunger. They paused by a serene pool, where koi fish glided like living jewels beneath the surface. "Such tranquillity," Miss Marple remarked softly to no one in particular, her knitting needles clicking idly in her lap as she sat on a nearby bench. But in her mind, she drew parallels to the deceptively calm ponds of St. Mary Mead, where beneath the lily pads lurked tangles of weeds ready to ensnare the unwary. Beauty, she knew from long experience, often veiled the sharpest thorns. As the group dispersed toward the house for cocktails, she lingered a moment longer, the evening breeze carrying a faint exotic chill. What secrets, she wondered, did this Sultan's garden hold? Chapter 2. The Unveiling and the Shadow. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a canvas of deepening indigo, streaked with the last fiery gasps of daylight, when the guests assembled under the grand silken pavilion in the heart of the Sultan's garden. Sir Reginald Hargreaves had spared no expense in creating this centrepiece. A vast tent of shimmering azure fabric, embroidered with golden crescents, supported by poles carved to resemble palm trunks. Lanterns hung from every corner, their flames dancing like captive spirits, casting a warm, flickering glow over the assembled company. A low table in the centre held the object of anticipation, a velvet-draped pedestal, guarded by two life-size statues of Ottoman guards, their marble eyes staring impassively into the gathering dusk. Miss Jane Marple settled herself on a cushioned divan, her small bird-like frame almost lost amid the opulent pillows. She had chosen a spot slightly removed from the others, the better to observe without being obtrusive. It reminded her of those village fêtes back in St. Mary Mead, where the unveiling of a new church tapestry could stir up as much hidden rivalry as any grand artifact. Sir Reginald, ever the showman, positioned himself beside the pedestal, his face flushed with excitement. "My dear friends," he boomed, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Tonight, we witness history reborn. This necklace, once adorning the throat of Pasha Ahmed's favourite consort, has journeyed from the shadowed halls of Constantinople to grace our humble gathering." With a theatrical flourish, he whisked away the velvet cloth. A collective intake of breath rippled through the pavilion. There it lay, nestled on a bed of black satin, the ruby necklace. The chain was a delicate filigree of gold, wrought into intricate patterns of vines and stars. But it was the central pendant that commanded the eye. A ruby the size of a pigeon's egg, its facets cut to capture the lantern light and hurl it back in crimson sparks. Smaller rubies flanked it like devoted attendants, each one flawless, pulsing with an inner fire that seemed almost alive. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her spectacles glinting. Beautiful, yes, but there was something predatory about that glow, like the lure of a venomous flower in a deceptively peaceful glade. Lady Evelyn Hargreaves stood rigidly beside her husband, her elegant gown of emerald silk whispering as she shifted. Her applause was polite, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers clenched the stem of her champagne flute, knuckles whitening. Was it mere fatigue, or something sharper, resentment perhaps, at yet another extravagance draining the family coffers? Victor, the son, clapped heartily, his handsome features alight with forced enthusiasm, though his eyes darted not to the jewel, but to Mr. Karim Al-Fayed, who lounged nearby with the easy grace of a desert panther. Al-Fayed's dark gaze fixed on the necklace with a proprietor's satisfaction, a faint smile curving his lips. Miss Clara Beaumont, the actress fiancée, let out a gasp that bordered on theatrical ecstasy. "Oh, it's divine! Like blood frozen in time!" she exclaimed, her voice carrying the trained projection of the stage. Dr. Elias Thorne, the antiquarian, hovered closest, his scholarly brow furrowed as he adjusted his pince-nez, murmuring something about exceptional Mogul influence under his breath. But Miss Marple caught the covetous gleam in his eyes, a hunger that went beyond academic interest. The group lingered a while longer, sipping chilled sherry from crystal goblets, as Sir Reginald regaled them with the necklace's provenance. Smuggled out during the fall of the Empire, hidden in a diplomat's valise, imagine the risks, he enthused. Al-Fayed nodded sagely, adding, "In Cairo, such treasures whisper of fortunes won and lost. This one, they say, brings luck to the bold." Thorne interjected with a pedantic correction. "Luck? More like a curse, if the legends hold. The Pasha's consort met a grim end. Poison, or so the scrolls suggest." Clara shivered dramatically, clutching Victor's arm. "How deliciously macabre! Do tell more, Doctor." But Lady Evelyn excused herself quietly, pleading the need for fresh air, her departure leaving a subtle chill in the warm evening. As the party transitioned to the dining room for supper, the atmosphere shifted to one of enforced gaiety. The long mahogany table was set with Ottoman flair, platters of spiced lamb kebabs, jewelled rice pilaf flecked with pistachios and saffron, and bowls of yogurt drizzled with honey from Sir Reginald's own apiaries. Candelabra cast elongated shadows across the walls. Where tapestries depicted ancient battles, their woven warriors seeming to watch the diners with silent judgment. Conversation flowed like the vintage Bordeaux being poured, light at first, then delving into the necklace's storied past. Sir Reginald dominated, spinning yarns of the ruby's supposed malediction. They called it the blood of the Sultan. Every owner, from pasha to merchant, faced betrayal or ruin. One poor soul lost his head in a harem intrigue. Victor laughed it off with youthful bravado, raising his glass. "Superstitious rot, father. It's just a pretty bauble, worth a king's ransom, mind you." But Miss Marple observed how his toast faltered slightly, his gaze sliding again to Al-Fayed, who merely smiled enigmatically. Clara, ever the performer, leaned forward, her eyes sparkling. Imagine wearing it on stage. The audience would be spellbound. Thorne snorted softly. Wearing it? Better to study it. The craftsmanship alone could rewrite texts on gem-cutting in the East. Lady Evelyn, having rejoined them, picked at her food in silence, her pallor suggesting more than indigestion. Miss Marple contributed little, content to listen and watch. She drew quiet parallels in her mind to the cursed heirloom in that old case at Gossington Hall, how objects of desire so often unearthed the basest human impulses. As dessert arrived, delicate baklava layered with nuts and syrup, the talk turned personal. Victor boasted of his recent London escapades, but there was a brittleness to his charm, as if masking strain. Al-Fayed spoke of Cairo's bustling souks, his words laced with subtle boasts of his trading prowess. Thorne quizzed him sharply on the necklace's authentication, eliciting a smooth deflection. "All papers in order, Doctor. Rest assured." After dinner, the group spilled back into the garden for liqueurs under the stars. The night air was velvety, scented with jasmine and the faint tang of fountain mist. Lanterns bobbed along the paths like will-o'-the-wisps, guiding wanderers through the labyrinthine beds. Miss Marple excused herself from the main cluster, feigning interest in a cluster of moonlit orchids near a bubbling fountain. It was a strategic spot. The water's murmur masked footsteps, but amplified voices carried on the breeze. She did not have to wait long. From the shadows beyond a hedge of clipped yew came the low, urgent tones of Victor Hargreaves. "You promised the funds by tonight, Karim. Without them, I'm finished. Creditors at the door, the lot." Al-Fayed's reply was calm, almost soothing, with that melodic accent. "Patience, my young friend. The deal is sealed. Your father's payment secures it. But haste breeds errors. Remember the Pasha's fate." Victor's voice rose a fraction, edged with desperation. "Damn the Pasha! This is my life unraveling. If father finds out about the loans—" The words trailed off as footsteps approached, and the two men moved away, their silhouettes merging with the darkness. Miss Marple straightened, tucking a stray orchid petal into her reticule as a memento. Intriguing, she thought. Debts and dependencies, like the tangled roots beneath these exotic blooms. She rejoined the others briefly, noting Lady Evelyn's early retirement with a murmured complaint of a headache, and Clara's flirtatious banter with Thorne, who seemed flustered by her attention. Retiring to her guest chamber, a sumptuous room overlooking the garden, with heavy brocade curtains and a four-poster bed piled with silken quilts, Miss Marple prepared for bed methodically. She unpinned her hair, donned her nightdress, and settled with a cup of chamomile tea, her mind sifting the day's observations like grains through a sieve. The necklace's allure, the guests' veiled tensions, it all whispered of undercurrents, much as in her village, where a simple garden party could mask simmering feuds. Sleep came in fits, the unfamiliar luxury of the bed proving less comforting than her own modest cottage. Some time after midnight, a sharp cry pierced the silence. Not the mournful hoot of an owl, nor the screech of a peacock, but something human, laced with alarm or pain. Miss Marple sat up, heart quickening, straining her ears. It came from the garden, she was certain, but faded swiftly into the night. A dream, perhaps, or the echo of those cursed tales manifesting. She lay back, dismissing it as fancy, yet a prickle of unease lingered. In the quiet hours that followed, the Sultan's garden held its breath, its shadows deepening with secrets yet to unfold. Chapter 3. The Body Among the Roses. The dawn broke over Hargreaves Hall with a deceptive serenity, the first rays of sunlight gilding the minarets and setting the dew-drenched gardens aglow. Miss Jane Marple, an early riser by habit, was already seated by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she watched the mist curl through the Sultan's garden like a ghostly veil. The cry she had heard in the night lingered in her mind, though she had half convinced herself it was merely the echo of some exotic bird. Yet, as she sipped her morning tea, brought by a nervous maid who seemed unusually pale, a piercing scream shattered the stillness, slicing through the air like a shard of glass. Miss Marple set her cup down with deliberate calm, her sharp eyes narrowing. The scream had come from the garden's heart, where the paths converged like the spokes of a wheel. Slipping on her cardigan and sensible shoes, she hurried downstairs, joining a flurry of guests and servants converging on the source. There, in a circular bed of crimson roses, chosen, no doubt, for their resemblance to the rubies of the Pasha's necklace, lay Sir Reginald Hargreaves. His body sprawled unnaturally, one arm flung out as if reaching for salvation, the other clutching the ruby necklace, its blood-red stone stark against his pallid fingers. A curved Ottoman dagger, one of his prized artifacts, protruded from his throat, the wound a clean, vicious gash that had spilled blood onto the petals, staining them like a grotesque parody of dew. Lady Evelyn Hargreaves stood frozen at the edge of the rosebed, her scream still echoing in her ashen face. "Reginald!" she gasped, before collapsing into the arms of a footman, her sobs theatrical, yet tinged with genuine shock. Victor, her son, stumbled forward, his face drained of its usual charm, his eyes wide with horror. "Father, no," he muttered, as if the words could undo the scene. Clara Beaumont, in a silk dressing-gown that seemed more suited to a stage than a tragedy, clutched Victor's arm, her tears glistening with practiced pathos. Dr. Elias Thorne hovered at the periphery, his scholarly detachment faltering as he adjusted his spectacles, muttering about barbaric precision. Mr. Karim El-Fayed stood apart, his expression unreadable, though his hands were clasped tightly behind his back, betraying a tension Miss Marple did not miss. The head gardener, Osman, a wiry Turk with weathered hands, hovered nearby, his eyes darting nervously as he murmured prayers in his native tongue. It was he who had found the body while tending the roses at first light, his routine shattered by the grim discovery. Miss Marple, unnoticed in the chaos, stepped closer to the scene, her gaze sweeping the ground. The dew lay undisturbed in most places, but near the body the grass was trampled, suggesting multiple footsteps, or perhaps a deliberate effort to obscure them. A single thread of sapphire silk, fine as a spider's web, caught on a thorn at the bed's edge, glinting faintly in the morning light. She tucked this observation away, much as she had once noted a stray hair on a vicar's stolen hymn book in St. Mary Mead. Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, his sturdy frame and brisk manner a reassuring contrast to the opulent disorder of the estate. A man of middle years with a soldier's bearing, he exuded competence, though Miss Marple detected a flicker of unease in his eyes as he surveyed the exotic surroundings. "A nasty business," he said, addressing the gathered company, after cordoning off the rose bed with the aid of 2 constables. "I'll need statements from everyone. No one leaves the estate until we've sorted this out." His tone was firm, but Miss Marple sensed he was daunted by the wealth and status before him, much like a new policeman tackling a squire's scandal in her village. The household was ushered into the drawing-room, where the silken cushions and gilded artifacts now seemed garish against the morning's grim reality. Craddock began his interrogations with methodical precision. Lady Evelyn, revived with smelling salts, claimed she had retired early with a headache and heard nothing, her voice trembling yet oddly controlled. Victor admitted to a solitary walk in the garden after dinner, seeking air to clear his head after too much sherry. His alibi was vague, his manner shaken, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hands, reminiscent of young Tommy Pierce after a brush with trouble back home. Clara swore she had been asleep in her room, her dramatic flair subdued by genuine fear, though her eyes darted to Al-Fayed as she spoke. Thorn, when questioned, rambled about the necklace's cursed history, insisting he had been cataloguing manuscripts in his room until well past midnight. Al-Fayed expressed sorrow with polished eloquence, claiming he had lingered in the pavilion over a cigar before retiring, seeing nothing amiss. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner with her knitting, offered no immediate comment, though Craddock sought her out as the morning wore on. "Miss Marple, you've a reputation for seeing things others miss," he said, half in jest, half in hope. She smiled demurely, her needles never pausing. "Oh, Inspector, I'm just an old spinster with too much time to notice human nature. But these gardens, they're like a village green, you know, full of paths that twist and turn, hiding more than they reveal." Craddock nodded, though she saw he was not yet ready to heed her fully. Men like him, she knew, needed evidence before intuition. Slipping away under the pretense of needing air, Miss Marple returned to the rose bed, now guarded by a young constable who allowed her a respectful nod. She examined the scene more closely, careful not to disturb the police markers. The dagger's hilt was ornate, its blade wickedly sharp, suggesting a weapon chosen for symbolism as much as efficacy. The trampled grass formed no clear pattern, but she counted at least 3 distinct sets of prints, one smaller, perhaps a woman's, blurred by heavier treads. Near the fountain, a few paces away, she spotted a glint in the gravel. A shard of curved glass, possibly from a broken lantern or lens, its edge smudged with what might be blood or earth. She left it for the police, but noted its position, her mind turning to the broken spectacles in a long-ago case of blackmail. Back in the drawing-room, whispers of motive began to surface. The butler, a discreet man named Jenkins, confided to a maid, within Miss Marple's earshot, that Sir Reginald had been arguing with Dr. Thorne the previous evening over discrepancies in the necklace's documentation. Osman, when gently questioned by Miss Marple over a cup of tea, mentioned seeing a figure near the pavilion after midnight, too slight to be Victor, but too fleeting to identify. "Like a djinn in the shadows," he said, his eyes troubled. Miss Marple smiled kindly, filing this away with the precision of a librarian cataloguing a rare book. As noon approached, Craddock gathered preliminary findings. No signs of forced entry, no strangers reported on the estate, and the dagger confirmed as part of Sir Reginald's collection, kept in a locked case until recently. The killer, it seemed, was among them, a thought that hung like a storm cloud over the opulent room. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her thoughts weaving a pattern from the threads of the morning. The silk on the thorn, the glass in the gravel, the cry in the night. It's always the small things, she murmured to herself, recalling a stolen pie that had unravelled a village theft. The small things that betray the heart's darkest secrets. Chapter 4. Whispers of Motive. The late morning sun climbed higher, its rays piercing the mist that clung stubbornly to the Sultan's garden, casting dappled patterns across the mosaic paths. Hargreaves Hall, however, was steeped in a different kind of haze, one of suspicion and stifled grief. The drawing-room, with its silken divans and gilded relics, had become a stage for Inspector Craddock's methodical probing, each guest a reluctant actor in a drama of secrets. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in a velvet armchair near a window overlooking the rose bed, knitted with the steady rhythm of a metronome, her mild eyes missing nothing. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, much like the tense silences at a St. Mary Mead parish meeting when gossip turned to scandal. Craddock, his notebook open and pencil poised, pressed the guests with renewed vigour. The absence of forced entry and the use of Sir Reginald's own dagger pointed to an intimate crime, one born of familiarity rather than chance. Miss Marple, though silent, drew mental parallels to a case in her village where a stolen letter opener had revealed a betrayal among friends. She watched as Victor Hargreaves, pale and dishevelled, faced the inspector's questions about his midnight wanderings. "I told you I was walking alone," he insisted, his voice cracking like thin ice. "Father and I had words earlier about money, but nothing serious." His eyes, however, betrayed a deeper unease, darting toward the door where Al-Fayed stood, his posture calm, but his fingers subtly twisting a gold ring on his left hand. Lady Evelyn, composed now in a high-necked morning dress, spoke with brittle precision. "Reginald was reckless with his spending," she confided to Craddock, her voice low but audible to Miss Marple's keen ears. "This necklace, it was to be his crowning glory, but I feared it would ruin us." When pressed about her whereabouts, she reiterated her early retirement, though Miss Marple noted the way her hand smoothed her skirt repeatedly, a nervous tick akin to Mrs. Price's fidgeting during a village inquest. Could Lady Evelyn's headache have been a convenient excuse, masking a deeper resentment? Clara Beaumont, her auburn curls slightly askew, played the grieving fiancée with theatrical flair, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I was asleep, Inspector, utterly exhausted from the evening's excitement," she said, her voice tremulous yet oddly rehearsed. Miss Marple observed a faint smudge of rouge on her cheek, suggesting a hurried morning rather than a restful night. Dr. Elias Thorne, meanwhile, grew testy under questioning, his scholarly demeanour fraying. "I was working on my notes, as I said," he snapped, adjusting his pince-nez with a trembling hand. "Sir Reginald and I discussed the necklace's provenance. Yes, but it was academic, not personal." Yet the butler, Jenkins, had mentioned their discrepancies argument escalating into raised voices. A detail Thorne omitted. Mr. Karim Al-Fayed presented a polished front, producing a leather portfolio with documents attesting to the necklace's authenticity. "All above board, Inspector," he said smoothly. his accent lending an exotic cadence to his words. Miss Marple, peering over her knitting, caught a faint irregularity in the wax seal on one paper, a date that seemed oddly recent for an artifact centuries old. She said nothing, but her mind filed it away, much as she had once noted a forged signature on a village petition. As the interrogations paused for luncheon, a subdued affair of cold meats and cucumber sandwiches served in the conservatory, Miss Marple slipped away to confer with the staff. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dobbs, a stout woman with a no-nonsense air, revealed a tidbit over a pot of tea. "Her ladyship was in a state last week, miss," she whispered. "Said Sir Reginald was planning to alter his will, cutting out young Victor, maybe even her, on account of his debts and her coldness." Miss Marple nodded, recalling a similar rumour in St. Mary Mead that had unravelled a family's secrets over a contested inheritance. The afternoon brought a private moment with Clara, who sought Miss Marple out in the garden, perhaps mistaking her for a sympathetic ear. "Victor's in a dreadful mess, Miss Marple," she confided, her green eyes wide with what seemed genuine concern. "He owes money, gambling, you know, and Mr. Al-Fayed was pressing him cruelly." Her fingers toyed with a powder compact, its silver surface catching the light. Miss Marple's sharp gaze lingered on it, noting a tiny chip of red embedded in the hinge, not unlike the ruby's hue. "Oh, that," Clara said, catching her look. "Just a bit of costume jewellery, nothing more." But her flush suggested otherwise, and Miss Marple tucked this clue away, like a stray button found in a church pew. Later she wandered the garden alone, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel paths. The rose bed, still cordoned off, drew her attention. The trampled grass had been photographed by Craddock's men, but she crouched, careful not to disturb the scene, and studied the earth. A faint imprint, not yet noted, suggested a heel mark, narrow and elegant, unlike the heavier boots of the men. Nearby, the shard of glass she had spotted earlier gleamed in the sunlight, its curve suggesting a lens rather than a lantern. Could it be from Thorne's pince-nez, perhaps damaged in a scuffle? Or something else entirely? She straightened, her mind turning to a broken monocle that had once pointed to a culprit in a village theft. Returning to the house, she overheard a heated exchange in the library. Dr. Thorne, his voice low but intense, was confronting Al-Fayed. "You knew the necklace's papers were suspect," he hissed. "If Reginald had exposed us, my reputation would be in tatters." Al-Fayed's reply was cool, almost mocking. "Careful, Doctor. Accusations are dangerous in such troubled times." Miss Marple retreated silently, her thoughts weaving a pattern: debts, forgeries, and a will under threat. It was like the old case of the missing silver teapot, where greed and pride had conspired in the shadows. As evening approached, Craddock called the guests together to share a troubling update. The dagger's case had been unlocked with a key, not forced, suggesting access by someone trusted. Moreover, a preliminary autopsy revealed traces of a sedative in Sir Reginald's system. Not enough to kill, but sufficient to dull his senses before the fatal blow. "Someone wanted him compliant," Craddock said grimly, his eyes sweeping the room. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. A sedative pointed to planning, not passion, a cold calculation reminiscent of a poisoned cordial at a village fete. She approached Craddock privately as the others dispersed, her tone gentle but firm. "Inspector, consider the garden's layout. It's a maze designed to confuse. The killer knew its paths well, someone who walks them often or studies them closely." Craddock raised an eyebrow, But she pressed on. And the sedative? Check the household's medicine cabinet, perhaps. Small details, you see, can unravel the tightest knots. He nodded, jotting a note, though she sensed he still viewed her as a quaint amateur. Alone in her room that night, Miss Marple sat by the window, the garden's minarets silhouetted against a starlit sky. The whispers of motive, Victor's debts, Lady Evelyn's fear of disinheritance, Clara's ambition, Thorne's obsession, Alphayed's secrets, wove a tapestry as intricate as the Ottoman rugs downstairs. "It's always the hidden thread," she murmured, recalling a mislaid love letter that had exposed a village affair. The ruby necklace, gleaming in Sir Reginald's lifeless hand, was more than a prize. It was a catalyst, drawing out desires as dark and tangled as the garden's deepest shadows. Chapter 5. The False Trail. The afternoon sky over Hargreaves Hall darkened ominously, heavy clouds rolling in from the west, casting the Sultan's garden in a premature twilight that mirrored the growing unease within the house. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the conservatory with her knitting, observed the shifting moods of the guests as Inspector Craddock's investigation tightened its grip. The air was thick with suspicion, each glance and whisper laden with unspoken accusations, much like the hushed exchanges at a St. Mary Mead bazaar when a theft was discovered. The ruby necklace, now locked away in Craddock's evidence case, seemed to cast a long shadow, its absence as potent as its presence had been. The morning's interrogations had yielded little clarity, but a startling discovery. Shortly after luncheon sent ripples of shock through the household. A constable, searching Victor Hargreaves's room under Craddock's orders, had unearthed a blooded glove hidden in a drawer beneath a pile of silk cravats. The glove, monogrammed with Sir Reginald's initials, was stained with dark, unmistakable smears. And its discovery brought Victor before the inspector in the library, his face ashen. "I swear I've never seen it before," he protested, his voice hoarse with panic. "Someone's trying to frame me. Father and I argued, yes, but I'd never—" His words faltered, and Miss Marple, quietly present in a corner with her needles clicking, noted the desperation in his eyes. So like young Billy Stubbs when falsely accused of pilfering apples in her village. Craddock, his expression grim, had little choice. "The evidence is compelling, Mr. Hargreaves," he said, signalling for Victor's detention in a guarded room upstairs. Clara Beaumont, witnessing the arrest, let out a theatrical wail and collapsed onto a chaise longue, her silk dressing gown pooling dramatically around her. "Oh, Victor, my darling, it's all a dreadful mistake," she cried, though Miss Marple caught the fleeting calculation in her eyes as she clutched a maid for support. Lady Evelyn, standing by the window, turned with a peculiar calm, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing tightly. Was it relief, Miss Marple wondered, or the satisfaction of a plan unfolding? Dr. Elias Thorne muttered about miscarriages of justice, while Mr. Karim Al-Fayed offered only a solemn nod, his dark eyes inscrutable. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. "Young men like Victor are impulsive, Inspector," she remarked softly as Craddock passed her in the hall. "But this murder feels like a chess move, deliberate and cold, not unlike a poisoned letter slipped into a village postbox." Craddock raised an eyebrow, accustomed to her cryptic insights, but promised to keep an open mind. She smiled benignly, her thoughts already tracing the threads of the case, the sapphire silk, the glass shard, the sedative in Sir Reginald's blood, each a clue as delicate as a spider's web. Seeking further insight, Miss Marple sought out Osman, the gardener, who was tending a bed of jasmine near the pavilion. His weathered face creased with worry as he recounted a detail overlooked in the morning's chaos. "After midnight, miss, I saw a shadow near the fountain," he said, his voice low. "Not Master Victor, too slight, moving quick-like toward the rose bed." He hesitated, then added, "It weren't right, that shadow. Like a ghost from the old stories my grandmother told in Ankara." Miss Marple nodded, her mind conjuring the elusive figure of a village prowler caught in moonlight years ago. "Thank you, Osman," she said gently. "The smallest glimpses often reveal the most." Her next move was bolder. Under the guise of fetching a shawl, she slipped into the guest wing, where Al-Fayed's room lay at the end of a corridor, adorned with Persian miniatures. The door was ajar, the room empty save for the faint scent of sandalwood. On a writing desk, among papers and a silver cigarette case, she spotted a small glass vial, its label faded but legible. A common sedative, the kind prescribed for nerves. Her heart quickened, recalling Craddock's report of the drug in Sir Reginald's system. She touched nothing, but the discovery sharpened her suspicions, much like a mislaid key had once unlocked a village mystery. As she returned to the drawing-room, a commotion erupted. Dr. Thorne, unnoticed until now, had slipped out to the garden and returned with mud on his shoes, the rich loam of the rose bed unmistakable. When questioned by Craddock, he stammered, I was examining the flora, a rare species of rose, nothing more." But his pince-nez slipped, revealing a faint scratch on one lens, and Miss Marple's thoughts darted to the glass shard by the fountain. Could it be a match? Thorne's agitation grew as Craddock pressed him, his scholarly veneer cracking like thin porcelain. The day waned, and a sudden storm swept over the estate, thunder rumbling like an omen. Confined indoors, the guests grew restless, their interactions fraught with tension. Clara, recovered from her fainting spell, hovered near Al-Fayed, her laughter forced as she recounted a theatrical anecdote. Lady Evelyn retired to her room, claiming exhaustion, but Miss Marple overheard her instructing Jenkins to secure certain papers in the safe, a detail that piqued her interest, reminiscent of a widow's haste to hide a will in St. Mary Mead. Victor, under guard, sent a note via a maid, pleading with Clara to vouch for his character. But the actress's response was cool, her loyalty wavering. Miss Marple, undeterred by the storm's roar, revisited the conservatory, where she examined Clara's powder compact, left carelessly on a table. The ruby chip in its hinge gleamed under the lamplight, too precise to be mere costume jewellery. When Clara retrieved it, she laughed off Miss Marple's inquiry. "A trinket, nothing more," she said. But her fingers trembled, and her eyes avoided the older woman's steady gaze. Miss Marple said nothing, her mind turning to a stolen brooch that had betrayed a thief's greed in her village. As night fell, Craddock shared a new finding. The sedative in Sir Reginald's blood matched a prescription from the household's medical cabinet. Accessible to all, but kept under Lady Evelyn's oversight. "It narrows the field," he said, though his tone betrayed frustration at the mounting contradictions. Miss Marple, joining him for a quiet word by the fireplace, offered a gentle nudge. "Inspector, consider the glove. It's too convenient, like a prop placed for a village play. The real killer would not be so careless, or would they wish us to think so?" Craddock frowned, but her words planted a seed, as they had with a sceptical constable years ago. Retiring to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the storm's lightning illuminating the garden's minarets like accusatory fingers. The glove, the vial, the scratched lens, the ruby chip. Each piece was a fragment of a larger puzzle, as intricate as the Ottoman tiles lining the fountain. "It's the false trail that misleads," she mused, recalling a case where a planted clue had nearly condemned an innocent man. Victor's arrest felt too neat, a distraction from the deeper currents of motive, greed, betrayal, perhaps even vengeance. The Sultan's garden, with its labyrinthine paths, hid more than flowers. It concealed a truth as elusive as a shadow in a storm, waiting for her to unravel its twists. Chapter 6. The Garden's Secret. The storm had spent its fury by morning, leaving the Sultan's garden glistening under a tentative sun, the air fresh with the scent of wet earth and bruised jasmine. Hargreaves Hall, however, remained cloaked in a tension as palpable as the damp mist lingering in the hollows. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, sat in the conservatory with her knitting, her eyes tracing the paths beyond the glass where secrets seemed to lurk like shadows in the foliage. The false trail of Victor's arrest, the bloodied glove, the sedative vial, all pointed to a calculated deception, much like a staged quarrel in St. Mary Mead that had once masked a deeper crime. Today, she resolved, she would unravel the garden's secret, for it held the key to Sir Reginald's murder. Inspector Craddock, though diligent, was mired in the tangle of evidence, his focus narrowed on Victor's detention. Miss Marple, however, saw the glove as a misdirection, too blatant for a killer cunning enough to wield a ceremonial dagger with such precision. She requested a private walk with Craddock, leading him along the gravel path toward the fatal rosebed, now a sombre monument cordoned by police tape. "Observe the fountains, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but insistent, gesturing to the marble basin where water danced in hypnotic patterns. "They draw the eye, don't they? Yet their ripples hide what lies beneath, much like motives in a quiet village feud." Craddock, accustomed to her analogies, nodded warily, sensing she was building to a revelation. She paused by the fountain, pointing to the spot where she had found the glass shard. "This, I believe, is from a lens, perhaps Dr. Thorne's pince-nez, scratched in a struggle. And the silk thread on the thorn, sapphire, fine, like the cufflinks he wore at dinner." Craddock's eyes narrowed, but she continued, her tone as gentle as a vicar's sermon. "The sedative, too, suggests premeditation. A hot-headed youth like Victor might strike in passion, but this was cold, calculated, like a poisoned cake left for a rival at a church fete." She urged him to re-examine Thorne's movements, noting his muddy shoes and evasive demeanour. Returning to the house, Miss Marple sought out the housekeeper, Mrs. Dobbs, in the pantry, where the woman was polishing silver with a vigour born of nervous energy. "Mrs. Dobbs," she began, her tone conspiratorial, "did you notice anyone near the medicine cabinet before the unveiling?" The housekeeper hesitated, then whispered, "Her ladyship, Miss Marple. She was there late, fetching her headache powders, or so she said." Miss Marple nodded, her mind flashing to a village apothecary where a mislabelled bottle had once betrayed a culprit. Lady Evelyn's oversight of the cabinet, coupled with her strained marriage, cast a new shadow on her alibi. The day unfolded with mounting tension. Craddock, acting on Miss Marple's nudge, summoned Dr. Thorne to the library for a second interview. The scholar, his face pale and his pince-nez conspicuously absent, grew defensive when pressed about his whereabouts. "I told you, I was studying manuscripts," he snapped. But his hands betrayed him. fidgeting with a pen that left an ink stain on his cuff, matching the sapphire hue of the thread. Miss Marple, present under the guise of offering tea, interjected softly, "Dr. Thorne, your lens, did it break recently? There's glass by the fountain, you see." Thorne's eyes widened, and he stammered, It fell during my walk, nothing more." But his voice cracked, and Craddock pounced, demanding he produce the damaged pince-nez. Under pressure, Thorne's composure shattered. "All right," he burst out, sweat beading on his brow. "Reginald accused me of falsifying the necklace's provenance. We argued in the garden, and I pushed him. The dagger was there. It was an accident." His words tumbled out, but Miss Marple shook her head, her expression as serene as a village spinster correcting a child's tale. "No, Doctor. An accident leaves chaos, not precision. The sedative in Sir Reginald's sherry ensured no struggle. This was planned, like a trap set for a poacher in a village wood." Craddock, sensing a breakthrough, pressed further, but Miss Marple's mind was already weaving a broader tapestry. She slipped away to the pavilion, where the unveiling had taken place, its silken canopy now sagging under the weight of morning dew. There she examined the low table, noting a faint ring of condensation, evidence of a glass left too long, perhaps the one laced with sedative. Her thoughts turned to Clara's powder compact, the ruby chip a damning clue. Could the actress have played a role beyond distraction? And Lady Evelyn's access to the sedative, had she acted alone or in concert? A chance encounter with Osmond in the garden should yielded another piece of the puzzle. The gardener polishing his pruning shears confided, "Miss, I saw Miss Beaumont near the pavilion after the men left. She was with Mr. Al-Fayed, whispering, looking frightened like." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, recalling a village girl caught plotting with a suitor behind the church. "Did they see you, Osmond?" she asked. He shook his head, his weathered face grave. "No, miss. I stayed in the shadows, like my old father taught me when bandits roamed the hills." Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple pieced together the threads. The dagger's angle suggested a left-handed strike, ruling out Victor and Al-Fayed, both right-handed. Thorne, however, was ambidextrous, a detail she'd noted when he signed a guest book with his left hand. Yet the sedative pointed to complicity. Someone had ensured Sir Reginald was vulnerable. Lady Evelyn's motive, tied to the threatened will, loomed large, but Clara's ruby chip and Al-Fayed's forged documents suggested a wider conspiracy. It was like the old case of the missing arms box, where 3 villagers had colluded to cover their tracks. She approached Craddock again, her voice low as they stood by the rose-bed. "Inspector, consider a partnership." The glove in Victor's room was a clumsy frame, but the sedative required access and trust. Lady Evelyn had both, yet Clara's presence in the garden and Al-Fayed's secrets suggest a shared purpose. Craddock frowned, but her logic was undeniable. He ordered a search of the pavilion, where a discarded sherry glass was found, its rim bearing traces of the same sedative. The net was tightening, and Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle nearing its solution, like a village jigsaw with one piece left to place. As evening fell, the guests gathered for a strained dinner, the opulent dining room a stark contrast to the grim mood. Clara avoided Miss Marple's gaze, her compact conspicuously absent. Lady Evelyn spoke little, her eyes fixed on a distant point, while Al-Fayed's charm seemed strained, his smiles forced. Thorne, excused from detention but under watch, picked at his food, his scratched lens replaced with a spare pair. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, let her thoughts drift to the garden's secret. A conspiracy woven from greed and betrayal, its roots as deep as the roses that cradled Sir Reginald's body. "It's always the quiet ones," she murmured, thinking of a silent accomplice in a village scandal, who hide the sharpest thorns. Chapter 7. The Ruby's Curse Unveiled. The sun hung low over Hargreaves Hall, painting the Sultan's garden in hues of amber and rose, as if the very blooms conspired to mimic the fatal ruby necklace now locked away in Inspector Craddock's evidence case. Inside, the air was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, the guests moving through the opulent rooms like actors awaiting the final act. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the pavilion where the necklace had been unveiled, felt the threads of the mystery drawing tight, much like the intricate lacework of a St. Mary Mead shawl, nearing completion. The garden's secrets were unraveling, and today she would lay bare the conspiracy that had claimed Sir Reginald's life. Inspector Craddock, emboldened by Miss Marple's insights, had called for a final gathering under the silken canopy, its golden crescents glinting in the fading light. The guests assembled reluctantly. Lady Evelyn, her face a mask of strained dignity. Clara Beaumont, her theatrical poise faltering under the strain. Dr. Elias Thorne, his new pince-nez ill-fitting and his hands unsteady. Mr. Karim Al-Fayed, his urbane charm now tinged with wariness. And Victor, released from detention but shadowed by suspicion, his eyes hollow with relief and lingering fear. Miss Marple, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, stood quietly beside Craddock, her presence as unassuming as a village spinster at a parish meeting, yet her mind as sharp as the Ottoman dagger that had ended Sir Reginald's life. "Murder," Craddock began, his voice cutting through the pavilion's stillness, "is rarely the work of one hand alone when greed and betrayal intertwine. We've uncovered a web here, spun from the allure of that ruby necklace." He paused, letting the words settle like dust. Miss Marple stepped forward, her tone gentle but commanding attention, as if addressing a village sewing circle about a scandal. "It's the small things, Inspector, that reveal the truth. A thread, a shard, a whisper in the night, like a mislaid glove in a St. Mary Mead garden, pointing to the wrong culprit." She turned to Al-Fayed, her eyes mild but piercing. "Mr. Al-Fayed, your documents for the necklace bore a forged seal, dated too recently for an artifact of such age. You sold Sir Reginald a lie, didn't you? A fake to cover your own financial ruin." Al-Fayed's smile faltered, his hands clenching. "Preposterous," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple continued, unruffled. "Dr. Thorne discovered the forgery, didn't he? He demanded a share to keep silent, threatening to expose you both. Sir Reginald, suspecting deceit, confronted you in the garden, where the sherry, laced with sedative, dulled his senses." Thorne's face drained of colour, his new lenses slipping down his nose. I only argued with him," he stammered, but Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Doctor. The dagger's left-handed strike matches your ambidextrous hand, and the glass shard by the fountain, your broken pince-nez, places you at the scene. You struck the blow, but not alone." She turned to Clara, whose hand flew to her throat, where no compact hung today. "Miss Beaumont, your ruby chip was no trinket. You took it from the necklace to secure your future with Mr. Al-Fayed, your true lover, not Victor. You lured Sir Reginald to the rose-bed, distracting him while the sedative took hold." Clara's eyes widened, her actress's poise crumbling. "I loved Victor," she cried, but her glance at Al-Fayed betrayed her. "Miss Marple's voice softened, almost pitying. Love or ambition? You planted the glove in Victor's room to shift suspicion. A clumsy frame, like a stolen brooch, pinned on an innocent in my village. She turned to Lady Evelyn, whose composure wavered, her fingers gripping the arm of her chair. And you, Lady Evelyn, provided the sedative from the household cabinet, knowing your husband's plan to change his will would leave you with nothing. You saw a chance to secure your future, didn't you, by letting others strike the blow? Lady Evelyn's lips parted in a silent gasp, but Miss Marple pressed on, her tone as calm as if recounting a village tale. The ruby chip on Clara's compact was your doing, wasn't it? A subtle accusation to divert suspicion, like a gossip's hint in a church hall. You knew of Clara's affair with Al-Fayed, and you used it to protect yourself. The room was silent, the guests frozen as Miss Marple wove the final threads. Greed bound you, Al-Fayed's ruin, Thorne's ambition, Clara's dreams, Evelyn's fear. Like three gossips in St. Mary Mead plotting against a vicar, you conspired, each believing you'd escape the net. Craddock, his notebook forgotten, stepped forward with newfound resolve. We've evidence to back this, he said, producing the forged documents, their ink matching a sample from Thorne's pen, and the sherry glass, its residue confirming the sedative. Osmond's testimony placed Clara and Al-Fayed near the pavilion, whispering after midnight, while the gardener's sighting of a slight figure corroborated their presence at the crime scene. The left-handed dagger strike, the scratched lens, and the ruby chip sealed the case, each piece as damning as a misplaced letter in a village scandal. Al-Fayed's mask slipped, his voice low and bitter. Reginald would have ruined me. The necklace was my salvation. Thorne, trembling, admitted to the fatal thrust, claiming panic, while Clara sobbed, confessing her role in the distraction but denying intent to kill. Lady Evelyn, cornered, remained silent, her eyes betraying a flicker of defiance. Craddock signalled his constables, and the trio was led away, their fates sealed by the garden's secrets laid bare. Victor, exonerated, embraced his mother, who wept quietly, her relief tinged with guilt. Miss Marple, stepping back, resumed her knitting, her work done. Human nature, she murmured to Craddock as the pavilion emptied, is the same everywhere, whether in a sultan's garden or a village square. The ruby's curse was no myth, just the eternal lure of what we cannot have. Craddock nodded, his respect for her now unguarded. "You've a gift, Miss Marple," he said, and she smiled, thinking of a St. Mary Mead widow whose quiet observations had once solved a theft. As the guests dispersed, the garden resumed its tranquil guise, the fountains murmuring as if nothing had transpired. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the rose bed, now free of its grim burden. The necklace, cursed or not, had drawn out the darkest impulses. Much like a coveted heirloom in her village had once sparked betrayal. She tucked her knitting into her reticule, ready to return to the simplicity of St. Mary Mead, where the gardens held fewer minarets, but no less intrigue. The truth, she knew, always bloomed in the quiet spaces, waiting for a keen eye to pluck it from the thorns. Chapter 8. Echoes in the Mist. The morning mist draped the Sultan's garden in a gauzy veil, softening the minaret's sharp outlines and muting the vibrant roses to ghostly hues. Hargreaves Hall stood quiet, its opulence subdued by the resolution of the previous day's revelations. Miss Jane Marple, her small suitcase packed, stood at the edge of the garden, her sensible shoes damp with dew as she awaited the chauffeur to take her to the train. The case was closed. The conspirators, Mr. Karim Al-Fayed, Dr. Elias Thorne, and Clara Beaumont, now in custody, their motives laid bare like the roots of a village scandal unearthed. Yet, as she gazed at the fountain's gentle ripples, Miss Marple felt the familiar tug of reflection, for no mystery, however solved, left the heart untouched by its echoes. The train station at Hargreaves Holt was a modest affair, its platform deserted, save for a porter who tipped his cap as he loaded her luggage. Miss Marple settled into the compartment, her knitting on her lap, her thoughts drifting to the events that had unfolded. The ruby necklace, with its cursed allure, had been more than a jewel. It was a mirror reflecting the frailties of those who coveted it. Much like a contested inheritance in St. Mary Mead, it had drawn out greed, fear, and betrayal, weaving a tapestry as intricate as the Ottoman rugs in Sir Reginald's hall. She smiled faintly, recalling how a village gossip's tale of a stolen locket had once unravelled a similar web of deceit. As the train chugged through the countryside, its rhythm soothing, Miss Marple pieced together the final threads of the case for her own satisfaction. Lady Evelyn Hargreaves, though complicit in providing the sedative, had escaped arrest, her role too subtle for legal proof, much like Mrs. Eldridge's sly manipulations in a village feud. Miss Marple had seen the flicker of guilt in her eyes as Victor, now freed, had embraced her in the pavilion. The young man, shaken but resilient, would inherit the estate, though the shadow of his father's death would linger, not unlike young Tommy Pierce's recovery after a false accusation in St. Mary Mead. The garden itself had been a silent witness, its labyrinthine paths and hidden alcoves concealing the truth, until Miss Marple's quiet observations had brought it to light. The sapphire thread, the glass shard, the ruby chip, each had been a clue as small yet vital as a mislaid button in a village mystery. Osman, the gardener, had been her unexpected ally, his fleeting glimpse of Clara and Al-Fayed in the night, proving as crucial as a milkman's testimony in a past case. The left-handed dagger strike, the forged documents, the sherry glass, all had pointed to a conspiracy, each participant believing their role would go unseen, like gossips plotting in a churchyard. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the necklace's supposed curse, whispered about during that fateful unveiling. "Not a curse of spirits," she murmured to a fellow passenger, a kindly woman with a basket of apples, "but of human desire. It's the same in grand estates or humble cottages. Wanting what we shouldn't breeds mischief." The woman nodded, offering an apple, and Miss Marple accepted it with a smile, her mind drifting to a village girl, whose greed for a neighbour's silver had led to ruin. Inspector Craddock had sent a note of thanks, delivered by a constable as she left the hall. "Your insights were invaluable, Miss Marple," he'd written, his tone warm with newfound respect. She tucked the note into her reticule, beside the orchid petal she'd kept as a memento. Craddock, like many before him, had underestimated her at first, seeing only an elderly spinster with a penchant for knitting. But, as she'd learned in St. Mary Mead, it was the quiet observers who saw the truths others missed, like a seamstress noticing a tear in a vicar's robe. The train's whistle sounded, pulling her from her reverie as it approached a junction. She glanced out at the passing fields, their simplicity a stark contrast to the garden's exotic splendour. Yet, she mused, human nature was unchanging, whether framed by minarets or hedgerows. Al-Fayed's desperation to salvage his fortunes, Thorne's ambition to protect his reputation, Clara's hunger for a glittering future, and Lady Evelyn's fear of losing her status, these were the same impulses that drove a village baker to cheat or a widow to scheme. The ruby necklace had merely amplified them, its crimson glow a beacon for their darkest desires. As the train neared St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to home, her cottage with its rose trellis, the church teas where gossip flowed like tea, the quiet evenings by her fire. The Sultan's garden, with its fountains and peacocks, would fade into memory, but its lessons would linger. She recalled a conversation with Raymond, her nephew, who teased her about this adventure. "You'll find intrigue even in paradise, Aunt Jane," he'd said, and she'd proven him right. The garden had been no Eden, but a stage for human frailty, its beauty a mask for treachery. Stepping onto the platform at St. Mary Mead, she was greeted by the familiar sight of the village green, where children played and Mrs. Price waved from her shop. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her heart lightening at the return to simplicity. Yet, as she walked home, she pondered the ruby's fate. It would likely be auctioned, its proceeds tainted by blood, much like a cursed heirloom sold off after a village tragedy. Would it bring misfortune to its next owner? Or was its power merely the projection of human longing? "No jewel is cursed," she murmured, passing the vicarage, "only the hearts that chase it." In her cottage, she lit the fire and resumed her knitting, the click of her needles a comforting rhythm. The case of the Sultan's garden was a quiet triumph, its resolution a testament to the power of observation over ostentation. She thought of Clara, her dreams shattered, Thorn, his scholarship undone, Alfayed, his charm broken, and Lady Evelyn left to face her conscience. Each had been ensnared by the necklace's lure, much as a village girl had once been undone by a stolen ring. "It's always the same," Miss Marple reflected, her eyes on the flames. "The heart betrays itself, whether in a palace or a cottage." As night fell, the village settled into its familiar peace, the church bells chiming softly. Miss Marple sipped her tea, content in the knowledge that truth, like a well-tended garden, always bloomed in time. The echoes of the Sultan's garden would fade, but their lesson, human nature's unchanging dance of desire and deceit, would remain as eternal as the roses in her own small plot, waiting for the next mystery to unfold.